The talk today on the course on United Nations and the word peace. Dear student, is relating to the peacekeeping done by the United Nations. And in the matters of peacekeeping, what is the role of General Assembly, the very important organ of the United Nations, where all states are represented? We have seen that the United Nations responsibility is the maintenance of international and peace. This is what is the responsibility of UN obligated to itself and to the members of the United Nations. So primarily UN is addressing this issue of peacekeeping. UNSC plays its role. United Nations Secretary General is obligated to play its responsibility, to work for the responsibility which is given to him in matters of peace and security, or independently he can also take up the role of peacekeeping, addressing these situations of peace and security. The role of the General Assembly is the talk of the lecture today. What charter has laid, what charter has laid down for the General Assembly, what is its responsibility in matters of peace and security. We will briefly look at it. What is the charter position of the United Nations with regard to the UN General Assembly role, and what United Nations General Assembly has in fact done in this area, and what are the possibilities that it could effectively play this role to address the situations where there are threat to peace, breaches of peace, and act of aggression. Dear student, I am Iqbalur Rahman. I teach political science in Aligarh Muslim University. I welcome you to this class. And I begin by talking about the working of the General Assembly. Dear student, General Assembly plays a key role in the financing of peace operations. It is the Security Council that sets the peacekeeping operation. It decides about its mandate. This is the primary duty of United Nations Security Council. The General Assembly actually is responsible for financing of peace operation. But this role is not limited only to finance. Besides this role, the General Assembly involves itself into peacekeeping through different methods, through different mechanisms. It addresses the question of peace and security in the questions of peacekeeping. Let us see how it plays the role. The General Assembly, dear student, is the main deliberative, policy-making and representative organ of the United Nations, comprising of 193 members, 193 member states of the UN. It provides a unique forum for multilateral discussions of international issues, including peace and security. It can discuss, deliberate, the issues of concern for the people of this world. The General Assembly meets in regular session from September to December each year and thereafter as required. It discusses specific issues through dedicated agenda items or sub-items which lead to the adoptions of resolution. Adoption of resolutions. General Assembly adopts resolution obligating the member states to, to accept the obligation and to work the for the realization of the agenda, the resolutions which the United Nations General Assembly adopts. It makes key decisions for the United Nations, including appointment of General Secretary and the recommendations of the Security Council, electing the non-permanent members of the Security Council, and approving the overall budget of the United Nations. We will in brief first review the Assembly's powers as described in the UN Charter, then we'll consider the way in which the Assembly has interpreted and acted upon those powers over the period of time, particularly in matters of peacekeeping. In 1960s, through the more recent responses to crisis in Syria, Myanmar, and Ukraine. General Assembly's competence as described by the UN Charter. Dear student, the General Assembly was granted the power to intervene and to make recommendations within the framework of the Chapter 6 and 7 of the UN Charter. In cases where the Security Council was unable to discharge its primary responsibility. The primary responsibility of the UN Security Council is what? To maintain international peace and security. This finds expression primarily in Article 10 of the UN Charter, which empowers the General Assembly to discuss any questions or any matters within the scope of the Charter and to make recommendations to the members of the United Nations or to the Security Council or to both on any such questions or matters. Article 10 lays down this role for the United Nations General Assembly. In other words, my dear students, all matters of international concern, including those falling to the Security Council in the first instance, were within the ambit of the United Nations competence, which Charter very specifically spells out. Article 11 and Article 14 of the UN Charter provide the General Assembly with additional recommendatory powers relevant to the maintenance of peace. Article 11, Part 2 empowers the General Assembly to discuss any serious questions relating to the maintenance of international peace and security and to make recommendations with regard to any such questions to states and or to the Security Council. The Article 11, Part 3 of the UN Charter empowers the Assembly to call the attention of the Security Council to situation which are likely to endanger the international peace and security. And Article 14 empowers the General Assembly to recommend measures for the peaceful adjustment of situations deemed likely to impair the general welfare or friendly relations among nations. Additionally, Article 13 of the Charter records the Assembly's primary responsibility for human rights and tasks the General Assembly to make recommendations for the purpose of assisting in the realization of human rights. Human rights sometimes become so serious issues that they, they become the threat to peace. And General Assembly, according to the UN Charter, shares this responsibility to, to address the serious violations of questions of human rights. One scholar says that the UN General Assembly was accorded almost a supervisory function vis-a-vis the Security Council and was made the real base of power in the United Nations. This could appear, dear student, to us perhaps a stretch, but the fact is that the division of responsibilities between the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council, as described in the Charter, reflects the compromise reached between the great powers and the small powers at the time of the creation of United Nations. This compromise is reflected moreover in the ambiguous nature of the Charter's provisions, particularly regarding the all-important matters of maintaining international peace and security. The ambiguity persists. Charter nowhere, dear students, prohibits the UN General Assembly not to take up these questions of peace and security. Explicitly, it is not provided. And over the period of its evolution, the interpretations at various stages, they have made this thing more clear that the ambiguity persists and there is no very clear boundary line which particularly separates the authority of UN General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council in matters of peace and security. The UN Charter also imposes restrictions on the General Assembly's power. It does. It does what? It imposes certain restrictions. The most significant is that, except with regard to the particular matters related to the finance and administration of the UN, the General Assembly cannot impose legally binding obligations on the member states. The recommendations by the UN General Assembly, are of recommendatory nature. They are not binding. This is clear from the text of the Charter, which empowers the Assembly to make recommendations to states. But in contrast to the provisions on the Security Council, does not say that a state does not say that states must comply with those recommendations. The non-obligatory nature of the Assembly resolution was affirmed by international Court of Justice in uh, its certain expenses advisory opinion. The most significant is the part of Article 12, Part 2, which provides that while the Assembly may discuss matters of international peace and security, and any question on which action is necessary shall be referred to the Security Council. The second explicit restriction on the General Assembly's competence is Article 12, Part 1 of the UN Charter, which provides that while the Security Council is exercising its function in respect of a particular dispute or situation, the Assembly shall not make any recommendation with regard to that dispute or situation unless the Security Council so request. The Charter, as I said, does not explicitly prohibits the UNGA not to address the questions of peace and security. It gives the primary responsibility though to the United Nations Security Council, but General Assembly. UN General Assembly is not barred from peacekeeping role. It plays its role through various mechanisms which it has laid down, which it has created, and it utilizes that structure for the furtherance of cause of peace. Let us see how it, it works. United Nations General Assembly works through its special committees. And one of the special committee is Committee on Peace Operation, a special committee on peace operations. The General Assembly monitors the performance of UN peacekeeping through its The General Assembly monitors the performance of UN peacekeeping through this committee. It was established in 1965 by General Assembly Resolution 2006 to conduct a comprehensive review of all its issues relating to peacekeeping. This is one of the very important committee while it comes to the role of UN General Assembly in matters of peacekeeping. This committee reports to the General Assembly on its work through the fourth committee, a special political and decolonization, and is comprised of 147 member states, mostly past or current contributors to peacekeeping operations, 14 other member states intergovernmental organizations and entities including the African Union, the European Community, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the International Criminal Police Organization Interpol participates as observer. The other committee, Special Political and Decolonization, fourth committee, the Special Political and Decolonization fourth committee, one of the six main committees of the General Assembly, considers the agenda item on the comprehensive review of peacekeeping operations and reports on this item to the General Assembly. The reports synthesize the committee's deliberations on the items and transmit the final version of draft resolution decisions recommended to the plenary of the General Assembly for adoption. The plenary considers the reports and votes the The plenary considers the reports and votes on the draft resolutions, decisions contained therein. The fifth committee is the Committee of General Assembly with responsibilities for administration and budgetary matters. Based on the reports of the fifth committee, the General Assembly considers and approves the budget of the organization in accordance with the Chapter 17, in accordance with the Chapter 4, Article 17 of the UN Charter. The Assembly considers and approves financial and budgetary arrangements with the specialized agencies and makes recommendations to the agencies concerned. The committee meets during the main part of the General Assembly sessions, and the first part of the resumed session, the committee meets during the main part of the General Assembly session, October to December. The first part of the resumed session, uh, in which the General Assembly decides to extend the length of the first resumed session to 5 weeks, starting from its seventh. The committee meets during the General Assembly session. It considers administrative and budgetary aspects of UN peacekeeping and possibly other questions or items that committee may need to consider. Many pursuant to resolution 49/23A, by which the General Assembly approved the present peacekeeping budget cycle. The fifth committee may also consider urgent matters relating to the financing of a peacekeeping mission authorized by the Security Council of its session, at any of its sessions. So, UNGA decides about the budget of peacekeeping, and in which these specialized, special, these special committees of the UN play a very important role. UNGA to UNGA also play very important role in matters of peace. And let us see how it addressed the questions of peace by involving itself. Let us first take the case of the Korean crisis of 1950. The United States of the United States of America, to get around the Soviet veto in case of Korean crisis, it sponsored a plan for the assembly to assume the reins of power in the event that the council failed to exercise its responsibility. This is called Uniting for Peace resolution, adopted by the General Assembly. The resolution stated that if not in session at the time, the General Assembly could meet in emergency special sessions, which could be called by the Security Council on the vote of any 9 members or by a majority of UN member states. Uniting for Peace resolution under the UN Charter. However, the General Assembly cannot discuss and make recommendation on peace and security matters which are at that time being addressed by the Security Council. Despite the UN Charter provisions limiting the General Assembly's powers with regard to peace and security, there may be cases when the Assembly can take actions in accordance with the General Assembly's this resolution. Uniting for Peace resolution of November 1950. If the Security Council fails to act, owing to the negative vote of permanent members, then the General Assembly may act. This would happen in case where there appears to be a threat to, to the peace, breach of the peace, and act of aggression. The Assembly can consider the matter within a the General Assembly can consider the matter with a view to make recommendations to the members for collective measures to maintain or restore international peace and security. So, through this resolution, General Assembly has been given the authority to authorize the use of force as provided under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, and which primarily is within the authority of United Nations Security Council. Acting pursuant to the Uniting for Peace resolution. Dear students, the General Assembly duly passed a resolution calling on states to lend every assistance to the United Nations action subsequent to the Korean War. The procedure described in Uniting for Peace resolution has been utilized 12 times. Acting pursuant to the Uniting for Peace resolution, the General Assembly duly passed a resolution calling on states to lend every assistance to the United Nations action subsequent to the Korean War. The procedure described has been utilized 12 times. In the early days, the resolution was most often invoked to facilitate the General Assembly's engagement in peacekeeping. The General Assembly utilized this resolution, Uniting for Peace procedure, to authorize the establishment of the United Nations Emergency Force in Suez crisis in 1956. It also requests the Secretary General to facilitate the withdrawal of foreign troops from the Jordanian-Lebanese border in 1958, effectively augmenting the mandate of the UN Observer Group in Lebanon. And it reaffirmed and arguably also augment the mandate of the United Nations operation in Congo in 1960. The United Nations General Assembly also utilized this procedure, like when it called upon the Soviet Union to withdraw its forces from Hungary in 1956. It endorsed the establishment of the United Nations East Pakistan relief operations in India, now Bangladesh, in 1971. It also called for the military assistance to assist African states to defend themselves against South African aggression in 1981. It also called on Israel to withdraw from occupied territories 1960 till 1940, and most recently, it called on the Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. The Assembly also convened an international conference to agree on withdrawal of foreign forces from Kampuchea, recommended various measures in response to Israel's aggression against Iraq, and the treatment of occupied Palestinian territories. The General Assembly's engagement in matters of peacekeeping throughout the 1970s and 80s showcased the Assembly's potential, where it was also criticized, where it was also criticized by those who felt that the developing nations were taking advantage of their numerical majority and bringing the UN into disrepute. This was the kind of the allegation which was made on the United Nations General Assembly's role in certain cases of peacekeeping. Some of the Assembly's critics at this time observed that while the General Assembly may have assumed the function of the words conscience on the issues such as apartheid, self-determination and opposition to aggression in Southern Africa, it was conspicuously absent when it came to conflicts between developing nations. This could be a case which could be some way uh, accepted, that it could not particularly deal with the cases which pertain to the developing cases. In 2010, the General Assembly, particularly in case of Kosovo advisory opinion, in 2010, the Kosovo advisory opinion, the International Court of Justice affirmed unequivocally that uniting for peace resolution provides the General Assembly to make recommendations for collective measures to restore international peace and security in any case where there appears to be a threat to peace, breaches of peace, an act of aggression, and the Security Council is unable to act because of the lack of unanimity of the permanent members. As the General Assembly's practice has evolved, there is arguably no longer any need for the United Nations resolution. There is no longer any need for the Uniting for Peace resolution. Even without this resolution, this provision, the Assembly is now clearly competent to make recommendations on matters of international peace and security, and it may meet in special sessions at any time. But as highlighted by the Security Council's referral of the situation in Ukraine to the Assembly in February 2020, invoking the Uniting for Peace resolution can serve as a political purpose. Serve as a political purpose that the matter was referred by the United Nations Security Council. A Security Council referral of a situation to the General Assembly shines a political spotlight on the urgency of the situation and on the imperative for a robust response, and clearly and publicly puts the onus on the General Assembly to recommend measures to restore the peace. This remains as necessary today as it was in 1950. The United Nations membership has risen to over 100, and developing states comprise the majority. The General Assembly's membership has risen to around to 200. The General Assembly's membership has risen to 193, and developing states comprise majority. Reflecting this shift, the focus of the focus of Assembly's debate, dear students, shifted from concern of the great powers, including the mandating and financing of UN peacekeeping missions, to those of the newly independent states. These included self-determination, the abolition of apartheid and racism, and later Israeli occupation of Palestine. This resolve of developing world nations around the issues of common interest in the assembly coincided with the period in which the UN Security Council, the United States, and the Soviet Union, presently the Russia, were disagreeing over just and about everything. So the question is that charter lays down a role for the United Nations General Assembly to address the questions of peace and security. There is an issue that the primary responsibility of peacekeeping rests with the United Nations Security Council. But it doesn't mean that the Security Council role unburdens the General Assembly. The Charter also imposes the responsibility on the General Assembly that it has to indulge into matters of peace and security when it comes before the international community. The UN General Assembly has to discharge this responsibility, which is the charter responsibility and which is also the overall responsibility of the United Nations. So, this share of the peacekeeping, which is entrusted to the General Assembly by the charter, so United Nations General Assembly's role cannot be absolved, that the primary responsibility is of Security Council, and therefore the role of the General Assembly is of limitations. It is not. And United Nations General Assembly, since the creation of the United Nations, has evolved itself into an institution whereby it has addressed the questions of peace and security at number of times, and in many of the matters its role has been very contributory and successful. For today, I end here. Thank you.